The Mafia boss was brought in dying, with no name. The fat ear doctor saved him in 4 minutes. His first words when he woke up changed everything. He had no name when they brought him in. No wallet, no phone, no identification of any kind. Just a man, enormous and dark and bleeding from a wound in his chest that had already taken 4 minutes of his life by the time the ambulance doors opened at County General. The paramedics were talking fast, rattling numbers and vitals, and the specific compressed vocabulary of people managing a situation that was running out of time. And Dr. Amara Okonkwo was already moving before they finished the first sentence, already pulling on gloves, already reading the body on the gurney with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who had been reading bodies in crisis for 11 years and understood that panic was a luxury that cost lives. She had seen worse. She had seen better outcomes from worse. She did not say this to anyone, because it was not the kind of thing you said in a trauma bay at 3 a.m. when 8 people were watching you and the monitor was showing a flat line, and the clock on the wall was marking every second with the specific indifference of institutional time. She said, "Clear the bay, get me a crash cart. Someone call cardiothoracic and tell them I need them in 4 minutes, or I am doing this without them." She said it the way she said everything, directly, without decoration, in the register of someone for whom authority was not a performance, but a function, as natural and as non-negotiable as the beating of a heart, which was, at this particular moment, the thing she was trying to restore. She worked. The room worked around her. On the 4th minute, the monitor changed. The flat line became a line with a shape, irregular and thin and fragile, and entirely, completely present. She did not celebrate this. She said, "Get cardiothoracic on the phone right now. I need a status on the OR."
She said, "Someone get me his blood type confirmed. I need the labs back in 10 minutes.
She said all the things that needed to be said in the order they needed to be said, because a pulse was not a recovery, and a recovery required everything that came after the pulse. And she was not finished. She would not be finished for a long time. She did not know his name. She did not need his name. She needed his pressure, his oxygen saturation, his core temperature, his response to stimulus. She needed the next 4 minutes, and the 4 after that. She had brought men back from further away than this. She would bring this one back too. Not because of who he was. She did not know who he was. Because he was a person. Because persons did not die on her table if she had anything to say about it. She had a great deal to say about it. She always did. Dr. Amara Okonkwo had chosen emergency medicine at the age of 22 in her 2nd year of medical school during a rotation in the County General ER that had lasted 4 weeks and changed the entire shape of her professional future. It had not been a dramatic moment of revelation. There had been no single incident, no one patient, no defining case that crystallized a vocation the way such things were described in the personal statements of medical school applications. What had happened was more ordinary and more permanent than that. She had walked into the emergency department on a Monday morning in October, and she had felt, within the first hour, that she was in the correct place. The specific quality of the work, the breadth of it, the immediate necessity of it, the requirement that you know enough about everything to manage anything that walked or was carried through the door, had matched something in her so precisely that it was less a discovery than a recognition. She had not found emergency medicine. She had found where she already was.
She was 34 now, and she was the senior attending physician in the County General Emergency Department, which meant that on any given shift she was managing an environment of controlled chaos with the specific, practiced authority of someone who had learned, over 11 years, to hold a great many things simultaneously without losing the thread of any of them. She was 5'7" and 250 pounds, with the broad, solid build that had made sports recruiters interested when she was in high school, and that had, in the intervening years, proved considerably more useful in the context of 12-hour shifts and physical interventions that required both strength and endurance than it had ever been on a soccer field. She wore her hair in tight braids pinned back during working hours. She wore no jewelry beyond the small gold studs her mother had given her at graduation. She wore her white coat like a second skin, because in many ways it was. She'd grown up in the south side of Chicago, the eldest daughter of two people who had emigrated from Lagos, with the specific ambition of people who understood that ambition without discipline was merely a feeling, and that the distance between a feeling and a life was made of daily, unglamorous work. Her father was an electrical engineer. Her mother was a registered nurse who had worked the night shift at the same community clinic for 27 years and who had come home from those shifts in the particular state of exhausted calm that Amara had watched throughout her childhood and had understood, even then, was not depletion, but something more complex. The specific quality of someone who has spent their professional hours being useful in ways that matter, and carries that usefulness home with them like a different kind of wealth. She had wanted to be a doctor since she was 9 years old, which was the year her younger brother had been brought to County General with a severe asthmatic attack that had frightened everyone in the family with a thoroughness and speed that Amara had never forgotten. What she remembered was not the fear, though the fear had been real. What she remembered was the doctor, a woman, black, large-framed and unhurried, in the way of someone who was not unhurried because the situation was not urgent, but because urgency that expressed itself in visible panic was not useful to anyone in that room. She had worked with the focused efficiency of someone completely equal to the moment, and the moment had resolved, and her brother had come home 2 days later, and Amara had sat with the image of that woman and the quality of her presence for a very long time before she had a name for what she was looking at. She had come to County General from a residency at Northwestern, where she had developed a reputation among her attendings for two things: an exceptional diagnostic instinct that they described variously as pattern recognition, clinical intuition, and in one memorable evaluation, an almost uncanny ability to hear what a patient was not saying, and a specific quality of calm under pressure that was not the blankness of someone who had shut down their emotional responses, but the steadiness of someone who had learned to carry them without being moved by them in directions that were not useful. The calm had not arrived fully formed. She had developed it deliberately through the specific discipline of emergency medicine training, which required you to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and time pressure that exceeded what most decision-making frameworks were designed for, and which taught you, through repetition and through the specific education of outcomes, that the internal state that produced the best decisions was not detachment. Detachment was its own failure mode, producing the correct actions without the attention that made them work, but a form of presence that was warm and engaged and absolutely stable. She had worked on this the way she worked on everything, methodically, with the understanding that the quality she was building was not natural talent, but a skill, and that skills improved with practice and degraded without it. She was, by any professional measure, exceptionally good at her job. She was also, by the measure of the people she worked with, someone who treated every patient who came through the emergency department doors with the same quality of attention. The homeless man who arrived every Tuesday evening with chest pains that were anxiety rather than cardiac, and who needed 15 minutes of someone listening to him more than he needed any pharmaceutical intervention. The city councilwoman who arrived with her staff and her entitlement and her insistence on being seen immediately. The 16-year-old who came in with injuries that were described as a fall and were not a fall, and with whom Amara spent 45 minutes before she involved anyone else, creating the specific quality of safety that made it possible for the truth to be spoken. The elderly man who had waited 3 days before coming in because he did not want to bother anyone, and who had been 3 days into a stroke. All of them received the same quality of attention. This was not, for Amara, a philosophical position or a professional policy.
It was simply accurate to the way she understood her function. She was a doctor. They were patients. That relationship did not have variables in it based on who the patient was, or what they could offer, or what kind of story they carried with them into the bay. She had been asked about this by residents and by colleagues, and once by a journalist doing a piece on emergency medicine in under-resourced urban hospitals. And her answer was always the same, delivered in the same mild, factual register. "I'm a doctor. Everyone who comes through this door is a patient." That is the complete description of the relationship. It was 3:17 in the morning on a Thursday in November when the ambulance arrived. She had been finishing the documentation on a pediatric case, a 7-year-old with a respiratory infection that had escalated faster than his parents had understood was possible, stabilized now and admitted upstairs, the paperwork the final act of a case that had been running for 90 minutes. She heard the radio call from the ambulance before the doors opened, and she was in the bay before the gurney came through, because the radio call had contained 2 pieces of information that overrode every other priority. Gunshot wound to the chest, and no pulse for 4 minutes. 4 minutes was the number. 4 minutes was the margin. Beyond 4 minutes, the calculus of outcome shifted in directions that required different conversations, and Amara did not want to have those conversations. She never wanted to have those conversations. Preventing them was the reason she ran toward the bay rather than walking. He was enormous. Even on the gurney, even without consciousness or volition, the physical scale of him was immediately apparent. Broad through the shoulders and chest, in the way of someone who had spent a great deal of his life being the largest person in the room. A fact that was currently working against him, because the mass of him made the mechanics of resuscitation more demanding. Dark hair, dark suit, expensive, and now destroyed. No identification. The paramedic leading the team was speaking in the fast, compressed rhythm of crisis communication, and Amara absorbed every word while simultaneously assessing what she could see. The entry wound, the position of it, the specific quality of pallor that told her how long the blood had been misdirected from where it needed to be. She worked. She gave commands, and her team executed them, because they were good, and because they had worked with her long enough to understand that her commands in a trauma situation were not suggestions, and were not collaborative starting points for discussion. They were the output of a diagnostic process running at full capacity, and the appropriate response was precise and immediate execution. Clear the bay, crash cart, cardiothoracic in 4 minutes, blood type confirmed, 2 large-bore IVs, push the epi. She worked through the protocol with the systematic efficiency of someone who had run this protocol many times and understood that efficiency in this context was not a virtue, but a requirement. That every second of hesitation or mis-sequenced action was a second subtracted from an account that was already overdrawn. Her team moved around her with the practiced coordination of people who had developed, over years of shared shifts, the specific kinesthetic vocabulary of emergency teamwork, the language of positioning and handoff and simultaneous action that did not require words because the words would have taken too long. She was aware of all of them, tracking 8 people and their functions with the peripheral intelligence that emergency medicine had built in her, the capacity to hold a wide field while maintaining a narrow focus. She did not think about who he was. There was no space in what she was doing for the question of who he was. There was space only for what his body was doing and what it needed, and how to give it what it needed in the time that remained for giving. The monitor was flat. She worked toward a shape. The room had a particular quality of silence in moments like this, not the silence of absence, but the silence of concentrated effort, every person in the bay directing all available attention toward the same purpose, the specific collective quiet of a group of people doing something together that required everything they had. Amara had felt this quality of silence many times and had never stopped finding it significant. The way a room full of people could become, for a few minutes, a single organism with a single function. She called for the next intervention. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady.
Not because she felt nothing. She felt the specific, focused intensity of someone engaged in the most consequential work her training had prepared her for. But because the feeling was fuel rather than interference, and she had learned the difference. At 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the monitor produced a shape. It was thin and irregular, and it was a shape. It was a rhythm, faint and compromised and entirely real. It was the difference between a conversation that ended in the bay and a conversation that continued upstairs. Amara said, "There you are." She said it quietly, to the monitor, or to the patient, or to neither, to the fact of a pulse resuming, the return of a rhythm that had been absent and was now present and was fragile and needed everything she could give it in the next hour to become something sustainable. She gave it everything.
The next 2 hours were the hours of stabilization, less dramatic than the resuscitation, more painstaking, requiring the specific, sustained attention of someone who understood that the crisis was not over because the immediate crisis had been resolved. She managed his pressure and his airway, and the cascade of physiological consequences of the trauma and the resuscitation itself, coordinating with the cardiothoracic team who arrived and took over the surgical component while she managed everything around it. She stayed in the bay longer than strictly necessary because she had learned that the transition period between acute resuscitation and surgical handoff was a period when things could go wrong quickly and silently, and she preferred to be present during periods when things could go wrong. At 5:30 in the morning, 2 hours and 13 minutes after the ambulance had arrived, she walked out of the trauma bay with the specific quality of exhaustion that was not depletion, but completion. The tiredness of a body that has given what it had and knows it gave enough. The man was alive. He was in the surgical ICU, 3 floors above the emergency department, with a cardiothoracic team managing the repair of damage that she had stabilized long enough to make repairable. He was not conscious. He had a pulse that was holding and a blood pressure that was trending in the correct direction, and no name in any of the hospital's systems. At 5:47, the lobby of County General received 23 visitors.
Amara knew this because the charge nurse came to find her in the documentation room, with an expression she recognized as the expression of someone delivering information they are not certain how to frame, and told her that there were a significant number of men in suits in the lobby who were asking about a patient who had been brought in without identification, and that 2 of them appeared to be carrying, and that hospital security was present, but was looking to her for guidance on how to proceed. Amara looked up from her documentation. She said, "Are they creating a disturbance?" The charge nurse said, "Not exactly. They are being very polite. That is part of what is unsettling." Amara considered this for a moment. She said, "Tell them the patient is alive and in surgical ICU, and that further information will be available when the patient is in a condition to provide it. Tell them the hospital's patient privacy policy applies regardless of how many people they have brought with them." The charge nurse went to deliver this message. 3 minutes later, a man appeared in the documentation room doorway. He was not one of the 23 from the lobby. He was someone who had come in a different way, through a different entrance, which told Amara something about the organization he represented and its familiarity with the geography of this particular building. He was perhaps 50, lean and precise, with the careful, controlled manner of someone who managed things for a living and was very good at it. He said, "Dr. Okonkwo, I am told you are the physician who treated the patient brought in at 3:17 this morning." She said, "I am the senior attending on shift. Patient information is confidential." He said, "I understand. I'm not asking for patient information. I'm asking to convey some information to you. The patient's name is Dominic Serra. I believe you will understand the significance of that name." Amara looked at him. She understood the significance of the name. You did not work emergency medicine in Chicago for 11 years without understanding the significance of the name Serra. It was a name that appeared in certain contexts, spoken in a certain register, and its significance was the specific significance of something that occupied a great deal of space in a city's operational reality, without being directly visible in any of the city's official descriptions of itself. She said, "I appreciate you informing me. The patient's treatment protocol does not change based on his name. He will receive the same standard of care as every other patient in this hospital." The man looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had expected this answer and had not entirely believed, before hearing it, that it would arrive in precisely this form, stated this plainly, with this absence of negotiation or caveat. He said, "Of course." He left the way he had come. Amara returned to her documentation. She had 4 more cases to close before her shift ended, and the man in the surgical ICU was no longer her patient in the direct, moment-to-moment sense. He had been handed to the cardiothoracic team and the ICU attending, which was the correct handoff, which was how the system was supposed to work. Her job had been the 4 minutes in the bay and the 2 hours after it, and she had done that job. She did not think about his name for the remainder of her shift. She thought about it briefly on the drive home, the way you think about the weight of a thing after you have set it down, not with anxiety, but with the specific awareness of someone who understands that something significant has passed through their hands and is now somewhere else. She had held his life for 4 minutes and given it back. What he did with it from here was not her department. She went home. She slept for 6 hours. She came back for her next shift. He was conscious on the 2nd day. Amara knew this because the ICU attending called her, which was slightly unusual, and told her something about the specific pressure that Dominic Serra's presence was creating on the upper floors of the hospital. The attending said that the patient was awake and asking questions, that his entourage in the waiting area had grown to 31 people, and that there had been 2 separate incidents of his security personnel attempting to access the ICU floor without authorization, and that the hospital administrator was asking whether Dr. Okonkwo could stop by, given that she was the physician of record for the initial presentation. Amara said she would come by on her rounds. She came by at the end of her shift rather than the beginning, which was a deliberate choice and which she did not explain to anyone who asked about it. She came by when the corridor outside the ICU was quieter, when the shift change had thinned the audience, when the quality of the hospital at 7 in the evening was closer to the quality she preferred, functional and purposeful, not performative. She went in. The room had been modified. She noted this without comment. The standard ICU room had acquired several items that were not standard ICU room items. A different chair, a piece of equipment she recognized as a secure communication device of some kind, and a man seated in the corner who was very still in the way that men whose professional function was physical were still when they were not actively needed. She noted all of this with the peripheral attention she maintained for environmental information, and she set it aside because it was not clinically relevant, and she directed her primary attention to the patient. He was awake. He was considerably more present than she had expected from a man who had been clinically dead 4 minutes before she touched him. His color was better than it had any right to be at 38 hours post-resuscitation.
His eyes, which were dark and very direct, tracked her from the moment she entered the room with the specific quality of attention of someone who noticed everything and had been doing so for a long time. She'd seen that quality of attention before in a variety of contexts. She recognized it as the attention of someone who had survived by watching carefully and responding correctly to what they watched. It was not an aggressive quality. It was simply extremely awake. It reminded her, in a way she found both appropriate and mildly ironic, of her own quality of attention when she entered a room with a patient in it. She picked up his chart. She reviewed his numbers with the thoroughness she brought to every chart review, which was the same thoroughness regardless of whose chart it was, and when she had finished, she set it down and looked at him directly. She said, "Your pressure is stabilizing well. The surgical team reports the repair is holding. You are going to have a significant recovery period, but the trajectory is positive." He looked at her for a moment. He said, and his voice was rougher than it would normally have been, scraped by the intubation and the general assault of the past 38 hours. "You are the one who brought me back." She said, "I am the attending physician who managed your initial presentation." "Yes," he said. "I was told it was 4 minutes." She said, 4 minutes and 11 seconds of asystole before we restored rhythm." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. There was something in his expression she had seen before, in patients who had been in close proximity to their own death and were still in the process of understanding the distance between where they had been and where they were now. It was not fear. It was not gratitude exactly. It was the specific, disoriented quality of someone who had been very far away and had come back and was not yet certain what to do with having come back. He said, "Why?" She said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "Why did you? It is 3 a.m. A man with no name and no identification. Why?" Amara looked at him. She'd been asked variations of this question before, by patients and by their families, and occasionally by colleagues who were experiencing the specific crisis of meaning that emergency medicine produced in people who had not yet found its center. The question always contained within it an assumption that the answer would be complicated, that it would require her to produce something philosophical or emotional, or at minimum explanatory. The people who asked it were usually looking for a story, for a reason that placed the act within a narrative of meaning and sacrifice and professional calling. She gave him the answer she always gave, because it was the true one. She said, "Because it is my job. You were a patient. Patients do not die on my table if I can prevent it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a person's face shifts when they have received something they did not know how to anticipate. The answer had not been the answer he was looking for. It was smaller than what he had been reaching toward, and it was, precisely because it was smaller and plainer and entirely without performance, considerably more striking. She said, "How are you managing pain on a scale of 1 to 10? He said, still looking at her in that specific, direct way, 3. She said, "That is probably not accurate, but I will note it. The nurses will offer you options that are more honest about what 3 actually feels like at 38 hours post-surgery. I would encourage you to use them. Managing pain effectively in the recovery period is not optional if you want the recovery to proceed correctly." He said, "I understand." She said, "Good." She completed her chart notes. She told him she would review his case again in the morning. She told the man in the corner, without looking at him, that the patient needed rest and that the room's quiet was a medical requirement rather than a preference. and she left it to him to communicate this to the 31 people downstairs in whatever language was most effective. She left the room. In the corridor, the man who had come to the documentation room 2 days earlier was waiting. He said nothing. She said nothing. She walked to the elevator and went back to the emergency department, where a child with a broken wrist was waiting to be seen, and she went to see her. If you need to know what happened in the 4 days that Dominic Serra spent in County General, what his people tried to offer and what Amara refused, what he stopped them from doing and why, and what he said to her on the morning of his discharge, then you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. The part of this story that changes everything is still ahead of you. He stayed 4 days.
Amara saw him every day because he was technically still a patient under her care in the coordinating physician role, and because the ICU attending had made very clear, in the diplomatic language of hospital hierarchy, that the Serra situation was one he would prefer to have senior attending involvement in for as long as the patient remained admitted. She understood this. She did not make it complicated. She came in the morning and reviewed his chart and asked him the questions she asked every patient, and noted his responses and adjusted his care plan accordingly. And she did this with the same quality of attention she brought to the 7-year-old with the respiratory infection, and the city councilwoman with the entitlement, and everyone in between.
Dominic Serra, who had spent 41 years in an environment where every interaction was calibrated to his position and his power, and the specific weight of what it meant to be him, noticed this with the focused, unguarded attention of someone encountering something genuinely new. She could tell that he noticed it, because she had spent 11 years reading the responses of people in hospital beds, which was one of the most information-rich environments she had ever worked in. People in hospital beds were frequently, for various reasons, less defended than they were anywhere else, and what they revealed in that state was often considerably more accurate than what they offered in the ordinary social environments of their lives. What Dominic Serra revealed across 4 days of morning rounds was that he was a man who was paying very careful attention. He was watching her the way she watched her patients, with the complete, unhurried focus of someone gathering information he intended to use. The difference was that he was gathering it about her specifically, and that the information he was gathering was not clinical. He was watching how she moved through the room, how she spoke to the nurses, how she handled the chart. Whether her affect changed when she was in his room versus the room next door, which he could partially hear through the wall and which she visited immediately before his on her rounds. It did not change. She was aware that this was what he was checking. On the second day, one of his people approached her in the corridor with an envelope. She said, before he had finished his opening sentence, "No." He said, "Dr. Okonkwo, Mr. Serra would like to express his gratitude." She said, "I understand. The answer is no." She went back to her patient bay. The man returned to the ICU floor, and she could imagine, though she was not present for it, the conversation that followed, the report of her response, and Dominic Serra's reception of it. She had said no to powerful people before, in various contexts, and she had observed that the quality of a person was most accurately readable in how they received a no they had not expected. Some people became hostile. Some people became more insistent. Some people looked for the angle, the approach that would convert the no into something more workable for them. And occasionally, rarely, a person simply absorbed the no and adjusted. She was curious, in a distant and clinical way, which kind Dominic Serra was. On the third day, the precise and careful man from the documentation room appeared again, this time in the corridor outside the ICU rather than in her workspace. He told her that Mr. Serra would like to know if there was anything the hospital needed, equipment, resources, any particular area of need that could be addressed anonymously. Amara stopped walking. She said, "Tell Mr. Serra that I appreciate the thought. Tell him that the hospital's foundation accepts donations through its standard charitable giving process, and that decisions about resources are made by the board of directors and the department administrators. Tell him that I am a physician, and that my function is patient care, and that those are different things." She paused.
She said, "And tell him that the attempt to find a way around a no I have already given is noted, and that I understand why he is doing it, and that I respect the instinct even though the answer is still no."
The man looked at her with the expression of someone who had not anticipated that last sentence. He said, "I will pass that along." She said, "Thank you." She continued her rounds. That afternoon, she was told by the charge nurse that one of the men from Dominic Serra's entourage had attempted to access the records room on the administrative floor, presenting credentials that were not hospital credentials and claiming to be conducting a compliance audit. Security had stopped him before he got past the corridor.
When Amara heard this, she went to the ICU. Dominic Serra was awake. He looked, she observed, better than he had that morning. More color, the specific quality of someone whose body was beginning to believe it was going to survive. She said, "One of your people attempted to access hospital administrative records this afternoon." He was very still. She said, "I am going to tell you something that I would ask you to hear as information rather than as a complaint. If anyone associated with you attempts to access records pertaining to any patient or any staff member in this hospital, I will have them removed from the premises, and I will involve the relevant authorities. This applies regardless of who you are or what your relationship to them is." He said, "That will not happen again." His voice was flat. Not flat in the way of a man who was managing anger, flat in the way of a man who had made a decision and was stating it. There was a difference, and she heard it. She said, "I know." She left. That evening she heard from the charge nurse that there had been a brief, quiet altercation on the ICU floor, not involving hospital staff, internal to the Serra entourage, and that afterward, 2 of the men who had been present in the waiting area for 3 days had departed and had not returned. She did not ask for details. She noted it. On the 4th morning, she came in for her rounds and found that the chair in the corner of the ICU room was empty. The man who had been sitting in it for 3 days was not there, and the room felt different for his absence, larger somehow, or more ordinary. Dominic Serra was sitting up in bed with the specific, careful posture of someone managing significant pain, with the deliberate composure of someone who was not going to let the pain be visible to anyone who did not need to see it. He was dressed, which was premature, and which told her something about his relationship with vulnerability, and she noted this in his chart before she said anything else. She said, "You are not scheduled for discharge until this afternoon." He said, "I am aware. I wanted to speak with you before you began your shift." She said, "I have 7 minutes before I am needed in the bay." He said, "That is enough." She sat in the chair that had been occupied for 3 days by his security, the plain, institutional chair that no one had thought to replace with something more appropriate, and she waited. She had been waiting for this conversation since the 3rd day, not because she had been anticipating anything specific, but because she had observed across 4 days of morning rounds that Dominic Serra was a man who was processing something that required more time and more internal space than the ICU environment was well suited to provide, and that when he had processed it sufficiently, he would want to say it, because he was not the kind of man who left things unsaid when he had decided they needed to be said. She had known this about him from the quality of his silences, which were the silences of someone holding something rather than the silences of someone who had nothing to hold. He looked at her for a moment. He had, she noticed, a specific way of looking at things that he was trying to understand, a complete frontal attention,
that most people found unsettling because it had the quality of assessment rather than social acknowledgement. The gaze of someone for whom looking at a thing was a functional act rather than a performative one. She had seen this quality in other people over the years, in contexts that varied considerably, and she had always found it more interesting than unsettling. It was, in its way, the same quality she brought to her diagnostic work. He said, "I want to tell you something, not as a thank you."
I have tried to thank you and you have declined, and I understand why, and I'm not going to try again. I want to tell you something as a fact, because I think facts are the language you respond to. She said, "All right." He said, "In 41 years, I cannot identify another occasion when someone looked at me and saw only a person. Not what I represent, not what I control, not what I can do for them, or what they might do for me, or what they need to be careful of. Just a person who needed something. You looked at me that way for 4 days. I was unconscious for most of the first day, so technically 3.5. He paused. Something moved in his expression, very small, the specific configuration of a man who has said a true thing and is still inside the experience of having said it. He said, "I am not telling you this because it requires a response. I'm telling you because it is true, and because you seem like someone who values true things." Amara looked at him across the small space of the ICU room. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was composing a response, but because she was doing what she always did when she received information, taking it in completely before she addressed it. She said, "You would be surprised how often that is all it takes for someone to look at you and see a person. It does not require anything exceptional. It only requires paying attention." He said, "In my experience, it is exceptional, precisely because it is simple and people still do not do it." She considered this. She thought about the man at the registration desk who had told her mother early in her residency that the waiting room was full and he would get to her when he got to her, in a tone that communicated something considerably more specific than logistical information. She thought about the resident she had supervised 3 years ago who had referred to an unhoused patient by his diagnosis rather than his name, and the conversation she had had with that resident afterward, which had been direct and which had been heard. She thought about the city councilwoman and the specific quality of her entitlement, which was not malice, but the accumulated residue of a life in which attention had been so consistently available that its absence had become inconceivable. She said, "You may be right." She stood. She had 6 minutes remaining before the bay needed her. She said, "Follow the discharge instructions precisely. The pain management protocol is specific, and there is a window for complications that has not closed. Return to emergency immediately if you develop fever above 38.5, increased breathlessness, or any change in wound drainage. Do not do anything that requires significant physical exertion for 6 weeks. I mean that literally and completely." He looked at her with that direct, awake attention. He said, "I understand." She said, "I know you think you do. I am asking you to actually do it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was very small. It was the specific configuration of a face that is discovering unexpectedly that it has been given something it did not know how to anticipate. In this case, the experience of being told something direct by someone who meant it as care rather than as a power arrangement. She said, "Good." She left. In the elevator going down to the emergency department, she thought about what he had said, not with the sentimental weight that the observation might have carried in a different context, but with the specific clinical attention she brought to true things. He was correct that it was simple. He was also correct that simple things were not the same as common things, and that the distance between the two
was where most of the damage in a human life occurred.
She thought about this for the 7 seconds of elevator descent, and then the doors opened, and there was a man with a broken arm waiting to be triaged, and she went to him. She heard about the donation 9 days later. She heard about it the way you heard about most things in a hospital, which was indirectly and in pieces, and from a source that was not official. In this case, it was the charge nurse, who had heard it from the department administrator, who had received a call from the hospital foundation's development office, which had been contacted by a law firm representing an anonymous donor. The donation was to the emergency department specifically. Equipment. The crash cart system that had been on the replacement list for 2 years, the one that had been approved in principle by 3 consecutive budget cycles and deferred each time because something else was more urgent. The defibrillation unit that was a model old enough that replacement parts were becoming difficult to source. 2 monitors for the trauma bay. The total value of the equipment was significant enough that the development officer had called the department administrator directly rather than processing it through the standard gift acknowledgement pipeline. Anonymous. No note. No attribution. The law firm, when the development office called to request further information for their records, had been politely and absolutely clear that the donor's identity was not to be disclosed under any circumstances, and that the donor's only condition for the gift was that it be used in the emergency department. Amara heard all of this from the charge nurse in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon. She said, "That is good news for the department." The charge nurse said, "Do you know who it was?" Amara picked up her coffee. She said, "The donation is anonymous. I would not speculate about the identity of anonymous donors." She went back to work. But she thought about it, in the spaces between patients, in the specific interior room where she kept the things she noticed and was not asked to account for publicly. She thought about a man who had been told no 3 times and had found a way to do something anyway that was not the something he had been told no to. She thought about the difference between a man who hears no and finds a way around it in service of his own interest, and a man who hears no and finds a way around it in service of someone else's. She thought these were different things. She thought the difference mattered considerably. She thought about what he had said in the ICU room, that she was the first person in 41 years who had looked at him and seen only a person. She had turned this observation over in the 9 days since he had said it, in the spare moments that her shifts allowed for turning things over, and she had arrived at a consideration that she had not expected to arrive at. She had expected to file the observation under the general category of things powerful people said when they were temporarily in a position of vulnerability, and their usual defenses were not fully operational. She had filed many such observations in that category over 11 years, and most of them stayed there. This one had not stayed. What she had arrived at, turning it over, was the recognition that the loneliness it described was real, and that real loneliness of that particular kind, the loneliness of a person who was seen so completely through the lens of what they represented that the person inside it had become invisible, was a condition that her work had made her familiar with in a specific way. She had seen it in the city councilwoman, whose entitlement was in part the residue of a life in which being seen clearly had become dangerous. She had seen it in the man who came in every Tuesday with chest pains that were not cardiac, who needed someone to listen more than he needed anything medical, who was invisible in a different register but invisible nonetheless. The specific mechanism varied. The underlying structure was the same. She did not know what to do with this recognition in the context of Dominic Serra, because the contexts of her life and his were not ones that typically intersected in any way that would make doing something with it possible or appropriate. She was a doctor. He was a patient who had been discharged. That relationship had a natural conclusion, and the conclusion had been reached. She set the recognition in the interior room where she kept the things she noticed,
and was not asked to account for, and she went back to the bay, where there was always someone who needed her. 3 weeks after the discharge, a courier arrived at the emergency department with a package addressed to Dr. Okonkwo, no return address. Inside was a book, a medical text, an updated edition of a reference she had used throughout her residency that she had not replaced because the newer edition was expensive and she had been managing with the older one. There was no note. The book had been purchased from a specialized medical bookstore in Chicago that she had mentioned in passing to no one in the hospital and to no one she could think of who was connected in any way to Dominic Serra. She thought about the careful man from the documentation room and the quality of his thoroughness and the specific kind of organization that produced that kind of thoroughness. She set the book on her desk. She used it the following morning on a case that required the updated diagnostic criteria in the newer edition, and the updated criteria were useful in the way that current information was always useful when the older information was no longer fully accurate. She did not acknowledge the book to anyone. She used it. It was a good book. She thought, all right. She thought, fair enough. She went back to the bay, where there was always someone who needed her, and she went back to the work that was not a calling or a mission or a sacrifice, but simply the correct place for a person with her specific qualities to spend her time, doing what she did, in the way that she did it. Outside the emergency department, the city of Chicago continued in all its ordinary and complicated ways, and within it, in the specific and considerable space that Dominic Serra occupied, something had changed in a way that neither of them had planned, and neither of them could precisely name. He had been seen as a person. She had seen him. These were simple facts, and simple facts, as she had told him, and as she had believed for 34 years, were not less significant for being simple. They were often, in her experience, the most significant things available. She checked the crash cart in the trauma bay at the beginning of her next shift, as she always did, and it was new, and it worked exactly the way a crash cart in a trauma bay was supposed to work, and she noted this with the specific satisfaction of a person who understands the operational value of the things around them working correctly. 6 weeks after the discharge, the 6 weeks she had specified, the 6 weeks she had told him were not optional, Dominic Serra walked into the County General Emergency Department at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. He was not a patient. He was dressed and upright and walking with the slight, carefully managed stiffness of someone who had followed their discharge instructions and was 6 weeks into a recovery that was proceeding correctly. He was not accompanied by 31 men in suits. He had one person with him, the careful, precise man from the documentation room, who positioned himself near the entrance in the way of someone who was there for professional reasons, and understood that his function in this specific moment was to be background. Amara was at the nurse's station completing documentation when he came through the door. She looked up because she always looked up when someone came through the door, which was the professional habit of 11 years of assessing arrivals before they reached the desk. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You are 6 weeks out." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is there a medical reason for this visit?" He said, "No." She looked at him. He said, "I came to see the crash cart." She held his gaze for a moment. Around her, the emergency department continued in its ordinary way, a nurse crossing behind her, a resident at the adjacent station finishing a call, the ambient sound of a department that was always, in some proportion, in motion. She said, "It is in Trauma Bay too." He said, "May I?" She said, "It is not standard procedure to show donors the equipment their gifts purchased." He said, "I am not a donor. The donation was anonymous." She said, "Yes, it was." A pause. She said, "Bay 2 is through that door and to the left." She went back to her documentation. She heard him cross the department. She heard the door. She did not look up. She thought about what it took for a man like Dominic Serra to come to a hospital on a Tuesday morning with one person instead of 31, to ask to see a piece of equipment he had paid for without being willing to say he had paid for it, to stand in an emergency department in the middle of its ordinary chaos without any of the apparatus of his usual power, and simply be present. She thought it took something. She thought it was not nothing. 12 minutes later, he came back through the door. He crossed to the nurse's station. He said, "It is a good machine." She said, "It is."
"We used it last week. It performed correctly." He said, "Good." He stood there for a moment. She continued her documentation. The department moved around them both. He said, "I wanted to tell you something else. I thought about it for 6 weeks, and I decided it was also a fact and that you would want to know it." She looked up from her chart. He said, "The man who shot me has been addressed. There will not be another event of that nature. I'm telling you this because you work nights in this building, and I would prefer that you know the environment around it is currently stable." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I appreciate that information." He said, "I know you do not need it. I know you would come to work regardless. I'm telling you because it is relevant to your environment and because you told me that you value relevant information." She said, "I did not tell you that." He said, "You showed me. It is the same thing." She considered this. She said, "You are correct that it is the same thing." He nodded once, the nod of someone concluding something. He said, "I will let you return to your work." She said, "How is your recovery?" He said, "Within the parameters you described." "Correctly." She said, "Good. If anything changes outside those parameters, come back through that door." He said, "I know." He turned to leave. She said, "Mr. Serra." He turned back. She said, "The book was also useful. The diagnostic criteria in the new edition are more accurate than the previous version. I used them twice last week." He was quiet for a moment. He did not ask how she knew. He understood that she had known since the book arrived, and that she had used it anyway, and that telling him now was a specific and deliberate thing. He said, "I'm glad." She said, "I know you are." He left. The charge nurse appeared at her elbow approximately 45 seconds after the door closed. She said nothing. She had the expression of someone who had witnessed something they were attempting to classify and had not yet arrived at a satisfactory category. Amara said, "I need the labs back on the patient in Bay 4 before I can clear him." The charge nurse went to retrieve the labs. Amara went back to work. Outside, Chicago continued in all its ordinary complexity, and within it, Dominic Serra walked to his car, and the careful man held the door and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would add anything to what had just happened. And Dominic sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the hospital entrance as they pulled away, at the ordinary glass doors through which an enormous number of very significant things had passed in the 6 weeks since he had been carried through them on a gurney, with 4 minutes of his life already spent. He thought about a woman who had looked at him and seen only a person. He thought that this was not a small thing, and that he had not understood until recently how large a thing it was, and that understanding the size of things accurately was, in his experience, the necessary first condition of being able to do anything useful with them.
He went back to his work. She went back to hers. These were different works, in different worlds, and the distance between them was real and significant, and not a distance that either of them had any particular plan to close. But something had happened in the space between a 317 trauma bay and a Tuesday morning visit to see a crash cart. Something small and plain and true that did not require a plan or a category or even a name to be what it was. She had seen him. He had been seen. In the specific economy of human connection, which was always more complex than the ledger anyone tried to keep for it, this was not nothing. It was, in fact, the whole thing.
If this story reached you, if you felt what it meant to be seen as only a person, nothing more and nothing less, in a world that almost never manages it, then this channel is where you belong. We tell the stories of the people who show up and do the work, and the moments when that work turns out to matter more than anyone expected. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that paying attention to another person is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. The next story is already waiting.